Saturday, January the 10th, 1981, Bo.
In the blue traditional prayer books, which are in front of you, please turn to page 38. We are in the middle of an extended process of endeavoring to understand the structure and significance of the traditional Shacharit service. We are studying it more or less as a text, ignoring for the purposes of discussion the theological implications, bracketing the theological implications. That is to say, whether or not one believes in the God in which the authors of the Shacharit service believed in, clearly this collection of verses from the Bible and original prayers would not have survived for as long as it did, would not have been repeated so avidly by the Jewish people, were it not that it contained some messages which satisfied deep-seated needs on the part of our people. What we are trying to do is to elicit, tease out those responses and those needs. I suppose it's a little bit like the fact that for many, many years, when people suffered from heart conditions, they were given a libation which involved foxgloves. By the way, before I forget, I want to welcome Sandor Hirsch to the synagogue. Those of you who subscribe to the Musical Heritage Society, does anybody subscribe to the Musical Heritage Society? Thank you. Thank you. All I needed was just one. There's a picture of Judith on the second page in the current, a very beautiful picture. She is a distinguished harpsichordist who just made some new recordings, and she's doing extremely well. But of course Sandor thinks that her daughter, his granddaughter, is the most important thing about Judith, never mind the harpsichord playing. It's a good Jewish father's approach. We just want to convey our congratulations through Sandor to Judith on this distinction of appearing in an internationally renowned musical catalogue. People who suffered from a heart condition were given a potion which was made of boiled foxgloves. One could use many other examples. And it wasn't, I believe, until the 19th or early 20th century that the element in that potion was extracted and understood scientifically. It was digitalis. Of course, what is being said is that accidentally or randomly, since people do things over a long period of time and learn by their mistakes, as in modern medical practice, the mistakes die. So one learns from the survival. People, for example, confuse the laws of kashrut with health. That wasn't the case at all. it so happened that the tribes that ate arsenic every new moon didn't live to tell the tale. Ultimately, in the long run, only the healthy rituals survive. And those that survive longest obviously have the most health implications. In the case of kashrut, it doesn't quite work out because I understand that chicken fat, according to the New York Times this week, is high in saturated fat and is very much advised against. So we have a few complications even there. Maybe Moses didn't understand the implications of gribbiness. At any rate, it seems to me that although our ancestors were not acquainted with the insights that we have today, the theoretical insights that we have today about the nature of society, and we do know a great deal about the structure of society today and the way that it functions, and I'm going to appeal to a modern author who not only throws light on what we have been studying, but throws into sharp relief the fact that it's quite obvious that both he and our ancient authors are on the same wavelength, although our ancient authors would never have been able to describe the situation with the clarity and the lucidity that he is able to. In other words, they were at the level of foxgloves. The author is at the level of digitalis. But ultimately, it's the same thing if it saves your life. And that is the crucial thing to understand about the reason why we are studying these ancient texts. There is nothing nostalgic about it. It is a very scientific, realistic understanding that if a piece of literature, if we wish to call it that at the moment, if a piece of literature has survived this long, we would be stupid to simply write it off and put in its place some newfangled nonsense which has no claim on our attention. We study the past in this institution seriously but not literally, which is why we have bracketed the question of the theology. That is to say, we respect our ancestors, we respect their genius, we respect their creativity, and even though we cannot accept everything that they bequeath to us literally, we take everything that they bequeath to us extremely seriously. And the image of Foxglove digitalis is not a bad one to bear in mind. Another example that I will just throw in as a kind of a mild digression, I don't think anybody who has not faced the problem of bereavement can possibly understand the enormous wisdom of traditional Jewish law in matters of death and bereavement. The whole concept of sitting shiva, the whole concept of not comforting the mourner until the actual funeral ceremony, the violation which is perpetrated in the modern funeral chapel by the visitation and the painting of the corpse and the artificial clothes and the tuxedos, the whole nonsense of modern funeral practice compared to the incredible wisdom of the ages. That wisdom, also a blend of foxgloves, has been given its digitalis dimension only in the last 50 to 100 years by the insights of modern psychology. The entire theoretical process, which we now understand a great deal about, of mourning, the process, the work of mourning, endorses from every point of view the traditional insights, the intuitions of our ancestors who were totally unaware of the theoretical implications of what they were doing. That is why we tamper with tradition very gingerly. Even where we cannot agree with tradition, we have to respect it. Even where we can't follow it, we have to try to elicit from it something that can be of value to us. And here I would like to move, since we do have some visitors, especially from England, who are blissfully ignorant of Reconstructionism. A central theme of Reconstructionism, which in fact invests all that we have been doing for the past several weeks in discussing the shacharit, the morning traditional service in this fashion, that is to say, we have been applying to tradition what Reconstructionism insists is the central methodology of trying to understand the meaning and purpose of Jewish religion in modern life. That is to say, we attempt to revalue tradition as opposed to trans-valuing tradition. This dichotomy, which Rabbi Kaplan discusses in the opening section of one of his most, I find, delightful books, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, which is available in paperback from the Jewish Reconstructionist Press, describes how up till the modern period, Judaism evolved unconsciously. That is to say, Jews altered the meaning of the past without understanding or being conscious of the fact that they were altering it. A very simple example would be the fact that in the Bible, itself, there is no real doctrine of life after death or resurrection or immortality. Yet the rabbis understood the Bible to include throughout that doctrine. The way they were able to do that was by unconsciously reading into the Bible ideas which the authors of the Bible did not themselves possess. That is the method whereby later generations transvalue the past. It's a method of continuity. If society is to endure, we cannot completely wipe off the past. We cannot live in the moment alone. We need not only our parents and our grandparents, difficult though that may be at times, in our immediate personal lives, we also need the fathers or the patriarchs and the matriarchs in terms of the ongoing continuity of the people. And that is why, even though we cannot identify totally with the literality of what they were doing, we must try to identify on some level with what they were about, and the method of transvaluation, of course, achieves that. And so the rabbis were able to read a text from the Bible as meaning the next world. An example, there is nothing new under the sun, from the book of Ecclesiastes, became, in the eyes of the rabbis who interpreted that verse, there is nothing new under the sun, but there is plenty new above the sun. That is to say, if one only thinks about this world, one is led to a pessimistic conclusion about life, a tragic vision. But if one takes into account what is above the sun, that is to say God, heaven, and the next world, then the sadness of this world can be transformed. That is one of hundreds of examples which could be given of how the rabbis unconsciously transvalued the past. They read into ancient texts their own ethical insights, their own cognitive insights, which were neither contemplated nor articulated by the ancients, but in some way were related to the strivings of the ancients. Revaluation is a phenomenon which is modern and is why Reconstructionism exists as an ideology. That is to say, revaluation arises from the fact that in the modern world we cannot interpret the past in terms of the present in a spirit of unself-consciousness. If there is one thing that does not characterize the modern age, it is unself-consciousness. We are self-conscious just about everything one can think of, and those brief areas which are not self-conscious yet are rapidly being made so by everybody who can get their fingers in and make an honest buck out of making somebody else self-conscious about something else. Kaplan writes on page 6 of the book to which I referred, the transition from traditional Judaism to the Judaism of the future can be effected only in the glaring light of complete awareness of the change involved. The problem of maintaining the continuity of the Jewish religion can be solved only in one way, and that is by being convinced that the continuity is genuine. Such conviction is compatible only with the certainty that whatever ancient meanings or values we choose to conserve and develop are read out of and not into the traditional teachings or practices. For that reason, we have to avoid transvaluation and resort to revaluation. And here is Rabbi Kaplan's definition of revaluation. Revaluation consists in disengaging from the traditional content those elements in it which answer permanent postulates of human nature, and in integrating them into our own ideology. When we reevaluate, we analyze or break up the traditional values into their implications and single out for acceptance those implications which can help us meet our own moral and spiritual needs. The rest can be relegated to archaeology. It is highly essential that we acquire the ability of getting at the really significant implications. They need not necessarily be such as the ancients themselves would have been able to articulate, but they should have psychological kinship with what the ancients did articulate. That is Rabbi Kaplan's definition of revaluation, and that is precisely, exactly what we have been doing these past several weeks with this particular segment of our traditional heritage, the Shacharit service. We have been trying to elicit from it those permanent postulates of human nature with which we can still identify. And to mention just one with which we have spent a great deal, on which we have spent a great deal of time, the contrast between what I call the childlike dimension of the early part of the service with its constant stress on giving a benediction over every single action that is performed when the Jew gets up in the morning, getting out of bed, stretching, standing on the floor, getting clothed, washing their hands, going to the bathroom, opening the eyes, rubbing the eyes, becoming more conscious of the fact that one is Jewish, that one is part of a family, that one is part of an extended family, which is the Jewish people, in time and place. All that partakes of a childlike quality which radically contrasts with the much more intellectual and cognitive and serious dimension of the material which is discussed at the end of the first section of the service. It is almost the distinction between dreaming, daydreaming, and the rational process whereby we try to live our lives. And even though we may not be able to identify precisely with the method that the rabbis use for invoking both the childlike and the mature dimension of the human personality in the morning, no one who studies the Shacharit service from this perspective with an honest mind can fail to be impressed by the need which this response of the rabbis satisfies, and the challenge, of course, whether or not our own worship service, however revised or reconstructed it may be, should not completely ignore these very basic fundamental psychological dimensions, which not only affect the personal evolution of the individual, but also are related to the group. I am deeply indebted to Simcha Rosenberg, who is not here this morning, for responding privately after last week's discussion, drawing my attention to the fact that not only does this obsession with the ritual, which we found was paralleled in the Middle Ages, as it were, throughout the very medieval civilization in its preoccupation with the sharp, childlike contrast. If you remember, if you were here last week, I read a paragraph from Huizinger's book, The Waning of the Middle Ages. Simcha Rosenberg drew my attention to the fact that it not only has a personal significance, but it also has a social significance. The book in question, which he referred to, was a very important book by Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, called Purity and Danger, in which she draws attention to the fact that there is a correlation between the particular rituals that people are preoccupied with and their sense of the cohesion of their society. That where the group feels that the parameters of their society are somewhat fluid and in flux, the greater the need for precise definition of the elements of everyday life, and that indeed in the Middle Ages the margin of society was constantly beset by other ideologies and other idioms which forced the individual within the medieval picture to focus more precisely on the contrast that we have already found exist in the Shacharit service. So what Simcha did was to take me beyond my usual preoccupation with the individual and the way in which the contrasting elements of the Shacharit service draw attention to the individual's evolution towards some form of maturity. This drew our attention also to the fact that one cannot totally ignore the kind of society in which the Jew lives. That where the Jew lives in a society where there is constant danger on the frontiers, a constant threat in the outside world, the greater will be the preoccupation with defining the area immediately surrounding the individual. But where there is a sense of relative security within society, then one can afford to play ducks and drakes with ritual and to be a little more relaxed because one knows that the margin is survived. I always had a problem, actually, incidentally, long before I read Mary Douglas, and of course I had the book and I read it many times before, but one can't always link these things together. That Americans, or English people for that matter, never make such a fuss about their festivals as Jews do. I mean, take Shrove Tuesday. I mean, all right, so some Meshugoyim in the middle of England throw pancakes in the air. But the idea that every Englishman on Shrove Tuesday would get up in the morning and get busy cooking pancakes the way Orthodox Jews get up Erev Pesach and start cleaning the house out is unthinkable. And I've often wondered, why was it that in the case of rituals in England or America, for example, those rituals were obviously functionally related to the existence of the group the way our mitzvot are related to our survival, why the Gentiles somehow take this in a much more relaxed fashion. You know, if the candles aren't lit on time, it's nicht so gefährlich. And if a bit of bread gets lost in the mix-up and is found on the first day of Pesach, you don't have to slit your throat or your wrists. I come from an Orthodox Jewish background where the preoccupation with the halakha was so great that one thought that the heavens would collapse if a minutiae. It wasn't really in retrospect, and one came to the conclusion the reason was that if you live in a country like England, which is surrounded by water as a moat, and the last challenge was from the Armada, and you've been able to grow your daffodils and mow your lawns undisturbed for 900 years, or if you have a sense of power such as America used to have, and a sense of identity such as America used to have, and a sense of being well defined from the rest of the world such as America used to have, one does not have to be so obsessed with what one does on Thanksgiving. You have a turkey, okay. You don't have a turkey, it's nicht so gefährlich. In other words, the fact that one knew who one was, societally speaking, meant that the need to define one's mitzvot dimension was the less important. And the more one was unsure of what one was. A Jew did not have a clearly defined demarcation line. A Jew did not have a clearly defined ocean surrounding him. A Jew did not have passport or some kind of definition. I always go through some mild kind of euphoria each year at this time when I get my car registration. It's a sense of identity. You know, if they spell the name incorrectly, there's a massive identity diffusion problem. And somehow one feels at times when things really get bad that one has to take out one's credit cards and, like reciting the beads as a Catholic or reciting the brachot, American Express, carte blanche, master charge, Visa, I exist, I have credit cards, therefore I exist. Bloomingdale's knows of me, therefore I exist. This is the sense of definition which one receives from the marginalia. And the more comfortable one is. As a matter of fact, there's a very interesting commercial which plays precisely on that, when a famous Italian opera says, everybody knows me when I sing at Covent Garden, or no, not at Covent Garden, at Lincoln Center, but when I go traveling, I always take... Oh, who else? Who else? Luciano Pavarotti, and you see the little typewriter, and you realize, with a glimpse of recognition, that Pavarotti also has the same identity problem. Never leave home without it. But that's exactly what the Jews used to say about the tefillin, and the talis, and the tzitzis, and the siddur. Never leave home without it. That is what gives you your sense of identity. Without that, who are you? So these ideas, if only we can unlock the door which obscures the past and the present. One of the greatest contributions of Reconstructionism, an enormous, prodigious contribution to modern Jewish ideology and thinking. I'm talking about the ideology now and not about the movement as such. The institutional dimension presents other problems, serious problems. I'm talking now about the ideology, and I want to keep those two problems quite distinct. The Reconstructionist ideology has presented us with an enormously valuable tool with which to approach the past. We approach the past, no matter how bizarre, how weird, how unlike our way of looking at things, with the assumption that our ancestors were not fools, that if they repeated this material day in, day out, 365 days a year, Sabbaths, festivals, and ordinary weekdays, something in it must have answered deep-seated needs in their private and collective lives, that we cannot repeat it exactly, but that we must understand, we must be able to extract the digitalis from the foxgloves. We must know what are the component elements, and indeed revaluation as applied to digitalis and foxgloves precisely indicates that if we are going to try to do things for people with heart conditions, what is important is to know what is the element within the ancient witch's brew that in fact provides the help to those who are suffering, and what is simply thrown in because of occultism or magic, or maybe even for placebo effect, which on reflection isn't something which one should kick either, because apparently even the placebo effect, even when something doesn't actually help but is believed to help, that can also help. And there have been many studies of people who have been treated for our condition with and without digitalis, which raises interesting questions as to whether, as long as you believe what you're getting is good for you, it doesn't also help. But at least from the modern point of view, we must be self-conscious about the placebo dimension and not simply walk into it without knowing what we are doing. So much then for the rationale behind what we are doing in the synagogue with our traditional texts. It is a quintessential exemplification of the Reconstructionist methodology. That is to say, to treat the past with respect. I had the privilege yesterday with my wife Naomi of visiting Mordecai Kaplan, who is at the old age home in Riverdale, and he permitted me to read some of the writing he's done the last year. Ethel mentioned it in her very beautiful article in the current issue of the Bulletin. And we did have an incredibly lively conversation, since Rabbi Kaplan is going to be 100 years old on June the 11th. And the message I have to bring today is, you must learn the Tanakh, namely you must learn the 3 sections of the Jewish Bible in Hebrew, and you must also, it's not a small order by the way, you must also learn the length and breadth of Rabbinic Judaism and medieval Judaism and all our sacred literature, and then you must read Kaplan. What was reassuring to me, because of certain things I have observed in recent years, was that Rabbi Kaplan may have changed his mind many times over in the course of the, I was going to say in the course of the centuries, in the course of the decades. It's almost getting in the course of the centuries. He's in great vigor. But one thing he has never wavered on, and one thing I have never wavered on, and that is that one cannot become a Reconstructionist with an empty Jewish belly. The greatest nonsense is perpetuated by either Reconstructionists who don't understand what Reconstructionism is and simply use it as a means of avoiding the obligations of Jewish life, or people on the outside who still daily think of Reconstructionism as some kind of Jewish heresy which involves not doing, not believing, and not belonging. There's somehow a vague general notion about the Jewish people married to a debilitating form of atheism is what constitutes Reconstructionism. Reconstructionism, in the words of its founder, is a profoundly learned approach to Judaism which is impossible without a depth knowledge in traditional Jewish values. You have to know Hebrew, you have to know Tanakh, you have to know Talmud and Midrash. Without them, reading Kaplan is a study in futility. I promised him I would tell you this morning, and indeed I am. It's important. One of the tragedies of Reconstructionism is the best Reconstructionists happen to be lapsed Orthodox Jews, as Rabbi Kaplan himself was. And the question whether we will able ever to make Reconstructionism efficacious in congregations that come to it with total Jewish illiteracy is something about which I have the profoundest questions. The profoundest questions. The kind of Reconstructionism you are going to get when people can't read Hebrew, can barely read English, and have no knowledge in depth of Jewish tradition is going to be some kind of a horrendous monstrosity, nothing related to the Reconstructionism of which Rabbi Kaplan has spoken and written for some 70 or 80 odd years. So for those of you who are visiting us this morning, I felt it my obligation to tell you that Reconstructionism not only is compatible with, but presupposes a deep, ongoing commitment to a learned Jewish life, regardless of one's theology. Whether one believes in God or not, whatever the kind of God one believes in, there are certain essential fundaments in the Reconstructionist approach towards Jewish life. Knowledge of Jewish tradition, awareness and involvement in current moral and ethical issues, not the least of which is the kind of honesty in cognitive and intellectual matters which is the basis of the distinction between transvaluation and revaluation, and an ongoing attempt to marry the best in the past with the best in the present. And clearly one is not going to be able to marry the best of the past with the best of the present if one is ignorant of both. So, we are endeavoring to revalue Shacharit, endeavoring to elicit from it certain ideas which must be of permanent value, the kernel, not the husk, the kernel. And this morning I want to draw attention to 3 concepts which are of paramount importance in Jewish tradition. I'm going to deal with them in reverse order, and then I'm going to read an extract from an essay written by Peter Berger, published in 1977, which was clearly written some years earlier in response to that apocalyptic and revelatory period in American life known as the 60s, in which God spoke daily from radical student meetings. And we will be able to understand, perhaps in greater perspective, where the Reconstructionist approach to the Shacharit service is coming from. I choose to start with the concept enshrined on page 38. And incidentally, as with the spiritual and psychic life in general, all of these concepts are overdetermined. That is to say, they all are multifunctional. They fulfill more than one purpose. Let me read 2 paragraphs from this Mishnah from Masechet Zevachim, and then I'm going to ask the congregation a question. I ask the question out of ignorance. What is the equivalent in American Jewish in American life, not Jewish life, in American life, what is the equivalent in American life of this kind of talking, this kind of discourse? I'm reading on page 38. Which were the places of sacrifice in the temple? The most holy offerings were slaughtered on the north side of the altar, as were also the bullock and the he-goat for the Day of Atonement. Their blood, which was there received in the sacred vessel, had to be sprinkled over the space between the poles of the ark towards the curtain of the Holy of Holies, and upon the golden altar. The omission of one of these sprinklings rendered the atonement ceremony invalid. The priest poured out the rest of the blood at the western base of the outer altar. If, however, he failed to do so, the omission did not invalidate the ceremony. The bullocks and the he-goats, which were to be burned, were slaughtered on the north side of the altar. Their blood, which was there received in the sacred vessel, had to be sprinkled towards the curtain and upon the golden altar. The omission of either of these sprinklings rendered the ceremony invalid. The priest poured out the rest of the blood at the western base of the outer altar. If, however, he failed to do so, the omission did not invalidate the ceremony. All these offerings were burnt at the place where the ashes were deposited. The communal sin offerings and those of individuals, the goats offered on new moon festivals and on major feasts are the communal sin offerings, were slaughtered on the north side of the altar. Their blood, which was there received in the sacred vessel, required 4 sprinklings on the 4 corners of the altar. How was this done? The priest went up the ascent, and having turned to the ledge bordering the altar, walked along it to the southeast, northeast, northwest, and southwest corners successively. The rest of the blood he poured out at the southern base. These offerings, prepared for food in any fashion, were eaten within the temple court only by males of the priesthood during that day and evening until midnight. What in American life? We need some civil servants to help us here. This material was written about sacrifices in the idiom of a theocratic societal entity. This is theocracy. Now, let's move to democracy. What would be the functional equivalent of American life of this document, or the quotation I gave this morning? I'd like you to give me a document. A document? A document, yes. In which all of this is... A document where one could open the document. I tell you, see, England comes to mind now, where one writes to Her Majesty's Stationery Office and gets the bills that have been passed by the... What? Ruth, can you help us out here? That would be an aspect of it, yes. There's somebody in the back row. Janet? The Constitution, yes. But the Constitution is I think it's too general. This is much more specific. This is getting down to the absolute nitty-gritty.
Income tax.
That sounds a machaya. That sounds much better. Yeah. As a matter of fact, those slim little pamphlets, which most of us, to our delight, are receiving at this time of the year through the mail, precisely gets close to what we're talking about here, yes. I don't know what a protocol is, Laney. I mean, I know what it means in some respect. Could you define what that means?
There are rules that are set up. The Library of Congress has. There are rules that are set up about, like Robert's Rules of Order.
Yeah.
There are rules that are set up for how the Electoral College meets, how they vote, what they are and aren't allowed to do, and then how it gets validated, particularly unless we put the Senate, where the Speaker of the House has to be elected so that he turns over the chair to the Assistant Speaker, who then calls for the vote, who then
Right.
is appointed, and then he gets moved back.
But Laney, this is much too close to the actual heart of the democratic process in terms of election. I'm thinking of a book of regulations, if such exists, which governs the operation of public service utilities. For example, is there anywhere a Shulchan Aruch v'Kon Edison? That's what I'm asking about. Ruth, do you know what in your experience, you see, we're talking here not about the actual worship. Sacrifices under theocracy perform the same function as keeping Big Alice going under a democracy. In other words, it maintains the fabric of the society. Unless these sacrifices are performed every day, the engine of society grinds to a halt. So what are the books that you have to know? I'm thinking of the notices that are stuck on the sides of buildings when, for example, a brownstone is being converted. Some paper is stuck on the outside of the building which relates to some kind of orders which ultimately can be found in some book. Yes, to the back row.
The Federal Register is right. The Federal Register publishes all very detailed, prescribed procedures on environmental laws, almost every life aspect of commercial life.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you very much indeed. We've all got the idea. I was not asking just to play games. I was asking because I couldn't quite think of the... You know, I like playing games with these equivalents. For example, somebody says, what is the Talmud? My late lamented, much revered teacher Ignaz Maybaum, who was from London, would say the Talmud may best be regarded as the Hansard of the Jewish people for a period of 500 years, of course, which translates into the Talmud was a congressional record. That's exactly what the Talmud was. It was a congressional record which recorded the deliberations from the standpoint of a theocracy within the academies of Babylon over a period of, and Palestine for several hundred years, in which you actually can find, of course the idiom is different because the theological perspective is different. Now, would it not be true to say that two concepts intersect in this particular Mishnah, these Mishnayot that we read this morning? One is definitely the idea of order, law and order, okay? Law and order. In other words, if you want to renovate a brownstone, you can't just do it from the back of your head. You suddenly decide you want to have a sidewalk cafe, and you want to make the sidewalk cafe jut 15 feet into West 86th Street. Obviously, any society has to have rules and regulations which govern the way people alter their houses. Your home may be your castle. Again, I'm sorry, it's the hell of bar mitzvah. I'm getting all these English metaphors are just pouring out today. Can't help it. It's all your fault, Sophia. Law and order, but also, would you not say that in addition to the concept of law and order, another thing intersects which we could say is triviality? I mean, isn't it rather trivial that in order for society to endure, there have to be people who make a living out of writing these kinds of books, and who spend their days and nights having to study these books? I mean, wouldn't it be better to... I mean, I do know certain people who read tax records for enjoyment, but they are slightly perverted. Usually one reads an Agatha Christie novel for light entertainment. One doesn't read a very heavy dissertation on the different ways in which can write off the loss of a bull that wasn't too healthy to begin with when you bought him, you know, in the ongoing running of the farm or whatever. Triviality, that is to say, without in any given society a group of people who specialize in trivia and who constantly remind us when we are talking in global ethical terms about what is right and what is wrong in society, that all your fine words ultimately, if we are going to live with each other in any kind of peace, must be boiled down to the trivia of a protocol, of a federal register, of a tax, what do they call the books in which tax records are, whatever the laws which govern these things. So much then for this first concept, which both relates to law and order, that there must be law, even though it's boring, but somebody has to bother with law, somebody has to take care of defining the minutest possibilities. What would happen if they turned to the left instead of to the right? What would happen if they forgot to sprinkle? What would happen if it was the wrong animal? What would happen if they didn't do it the right way? What would happen if they did it and it was against the law? Would you have to knock it down and build up again? Or would you turn the other way? Or would you ask for compensation? Or would there be a fine? All these trivia are bound up with the concept of law and order. Let's move to another happier theme. We've already touched on the idea of law and order, which incidentally could lead in other areas, but let's go to a very simple theme here on page 13, which again is highly appropriate for the occasion of a bat mitzvah. I'll read in the English. Lord our God, make the words of thy Torah pleasant in our mouths and in the mouths of thy people, the house of Israel, so that we, our descendants, and the descendants of thy people, the house of Israel, may all know thy name and study the Torah for its own sake. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who teaches the Torah to thy people Israel. It's talking about children. In fact, the central theme of the morning service is children. We refer to the childlike quality of the opening blessings. I got up, I opened my eyes, I brushed my teeth, I had my cornflakes, I got dressed, I went out into the garden, I played with the dog. In other words, there's a childlike quality that here specifically, and in some texts, not only it's v'nihiyanachnu v'tze'etza'enu, but also v'tze'etza'e, tze'etza'enu, v'tze'etza'e kol amcha bet Yisrael, that we, our children, and our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, what is this? It's a sense of continuity. No matter what is said one way or another about modern sexual lifestyles, without some kind or version or form of the nuclear family, no society can endure. One can't endure by communes. One can't endure by chaburot. One can't endure by fly-by-night idealistic schemes to radically change the order of society. There have to be parents and grandparents and children and grandchildren. The grind of raising children, which is fortunately temporarily numbed by those psychological mechanisms which have been evolved over a period of time to blind parents into realizing what's going to happen when the children grow up, so they have them quickly before they know the implications of what they're doing, and by the time they've got them, it's too late. So all these principles are principles of continuity. Sometimes one has to cut behind the garbage and nonsense that we hear from every corner about the modern lifestyle to realize that the salt of society, the fiber of society, the background are the millions of unspoken heroes, unwept, unhonored, and unsung. The parents who freeze in the lobby of the SAJ on Tuesday nights and Thursday nights waiting to pick up their children from Hebrew school and bring them in early when they have to come on Sunday morning. That is to say, it isn't romantic. There's nothing exciting about it. It's nothing spectacular. It's boring, it's heavy, it's a burden, and somebody should say so for once, but without that kind of commitment to boredom, without that kind of commitment to the ongoing drag of making sure that little Moshe does his piano practice in the morning, that he does his homework, that he's washed behind the ears, and in the case of adolescents, that he's had a shower at least once in the calendar year, then all your idealistic efflorescence of your village voices and the rest are so much sawdust. They don't make for human survival. It is the base, the fulcrum of civilization, the fathers and the mothers who shoulder their responsibilities and their liabilities. There's a great deal of nonsense spoken about the family today. Nonsense spoken about people who are too busy speaking nonsense to worry about the commitment that is involved, the commitment to get married, the commitment to raise a family, the commitment to the past and to the future, the responsibility to look after your parents. And what a marvelous sight it was to see the old age home at Riverdale. Believe me, you should go and see it just as a kind of a symbol of what might be in our own society, of the way in which a society can look after its aged. I thought if only one could have something like that in Harlem, not just for people over the age of 90, but for the people who are under the age of 90 days, for the infants and the babies. Somehow, surely if we can do it in one area of society, the same kind of love and devotion and attention, the pictures, the music, bird cages, the attention, the love of the nurses and the physical therapy and the dining halls, the beautiful, beautiful experience to see what can only be done when people try in our society to make human life meaningful and purposeful and worth living. It elicits the best in all who are there and all who partake in it. And this is the kind of thing when children also are responsible to their parents and realize that you can't just write your parents off, that you have to have a kind of ongoing commitment. This is the ongoing consistency without which society cannot endure. Now, we've touched on three concepts today. One is law and order, which we could have gone on further and shown is reflected in the Psalms. I'll just give one example, because ultimately one would have to put every single verse and every single concept in every single verse on 5x4 index cards and then collate them to show how each theme is recapitulated over and over again in a very subtle fashion, like a leitmotif in a Wagner overture or in a Wagner opera. Here we have one of the Psalms where a verse which is constantly repeated throughout the Jewish liturgy, page 57, Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Yimloch Leolam Va'ed, picking up the notion of parent, grandparent, child, grandchild, great-grandchild. God is king. God was king. God shall be king. This picks up again the theme of law and order, that God is king. He created the world. There is order in the cosmos, and as we shall see in weeks to come when we proceed to discuss these ideas in greater detail, because there is a wealth of richness in these pages, the stress on God as the Lord of nature, and God as the Lord of history, and God as the giver of the law. We don't have to look too far to this trinity of concepts. We had them over the High Holy Days in Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. It is a theme which we pick up more specifically and more pointedly and more focused on the High Holy Days, but these are the Trinity concepts of Jewish life. God is king. There must be law and order. God remembers. We cannot live for the moment. We cannot have instant life and instant Judaism. There has to be an ongoing continuity of the generations. And the shofar, which is associated on one level with the shofar that was blown, the heavenly shofar that was sounded when God revealed the Torah on Mount Sinai, as described in the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, that refers to revelation, that there must be federal registers, there must be protocols, there must be rules and regulations. You have to have law, otherwise society cannot endure. Now I want to go back briefly to this essay of Peter Berger, which is a response to the 60s. And I must say that it has a great deal to teach Reconstructionists. First of all, I would simply read to you the paradox with which he begins this essay. He says, I want to start this subject by two seemingly contradictory propositions. We will not be able to finish this topic completely this morning, but at least we can start on it. The two seemingly contradictory propositions are: sociology is subversive of established patterns of thought. Sociology is conservative in its implications for the institutional order. And he says, I would like to suggest that both propositions are correct. I want to substitute Reconstructionism for sociology in that sentence and read it again. Because what Peter Berger has done is to pinpoint precisely where I personally stand on the issue of Reconstructionism. Reconstructionism is subversive of established patterns of thought. I don't have to even go into that because it's quite obvious. Any religious viewpoint which questions the belief in the old man in the clouds, that actually affirms in the course of its religious service that we don't believe in that kind of a God, and that Judaism exists for the Jewish people, not the other way around, Jewish religion exists for the Jews and not Jews for the Jewish people, cannot be accused of exactly not being subversive of established patterns. Anybody who knows anything at all about Reconstructionism knows that it is extremely subversive. But also, I would say, Reconstructionism is conservative in its implications for the institutional order. And that is something which most Reconstructionists, as I know, do not fully understand. That is why Reconstructionism is compatible with a traditional form of worship. That is why Reconstructionism is compatible with the traditional mode of deciding who is and who is not Jewish, and who is not Jewishly married. Because it is only a failure to understand Reconstructionism that places its understanding on one horn of the dilemma and one side of the dichotomous statement. Reconstructionism is both subversive and also conservative. This is an idea that we will come back to in the future, but right now I simply want to say a few words about three important ideas. By the way, there's another thing that he says at the end of this chapter which is equally good. He says, the conservatism that I'm talking about is not based on on propositions about subversiveness of sociology. I would like to say that it talks about the stance of a man who thinks daringly but acts prudently, which meshes perfectly with my long-standing definition of Reconstructionist as a man who thinks treif and acts kosher. That is to say, a subversive approach to understanding the meaning and implications of Jewish life, but a very careful respect for the boundaries of what constitute Jewish law and order. Now, those parentheses of this material will have to be discussed at some later stage, because clearly the implications of what he means by Reconstructionism being subversive is very interesting. And one example would be enough to put you on the track. He says he was teaching in a southern town, and it was in 1956, and a barber who was cutting his hair, I hope he wasn't shaving him, a barber who was cutting his hair said, "Oh, you sociologists, I know about you. You're the guys who wrote all those footnotes in the Supreme Court decision on getting the blacks into schools." It's a very interesting thing, you see. He was right, Berger says, in an extended sense, if not literally. I wonder how many of the sociologists, some of them Southerners living comfortably in a segregated society, who busily gathered all those data on the place of the Negro in American society, imagined that they were providing the legitimations for one of the great social transformations of our time. In that sense, sociology is radically subversive, because its very cognitive approach raises questions in people's minds which challenge the very foundation of certain moral inequities within the society and generate the change within the framework of society. All right. Let me go, he says, to my second proposition, that sociology is conservative in its implications for the institutional order, which I interpret precisely as Reconstructionism, if it is to be an authentic Reconstructionism, and not an illiterate, fly-by-night Reconstructionism based on the ignorance of the many and the stupidity of the few, which it is in great danger of becoming if we don't watch out for it. Speaks of a conservative sociology from the institutional order's implications. Put differently, he says, sociology, far from leading to revolutionary practice, actually inhibits revolution. You see, he's talking about the 60s when everybody went to the sociologists and asked them either to become their gurus or to throw bombs into the faculty meetings. Misunderstanding what sociology, of course, was about. Put differently, revolutionaries have as good reason to be suspicious of sociology as policemen. Revolutionaries should be as afraid of sociology as policemen. The point can be made economically, he says, by way of three imperatives, which in my opinion, sociological understanding can show to be present in every single human community. In other words, any community that is going to survive, any community that is going to endure, must contain within it these three imperatives. And listen to what these three imperatives are in view of our discussion of the Shacharit service this morning. Order, continuity, and triviality. And there's no time this morning to give a detailed description of the three things, but let me say a little bit. Let me quote a little bit from what he says. It's very relevant. Each one of these imperatives, order, continuity, and triviality, flies in the face of some of the fondest beliefs of the contemporary left. He's talking of the 60s. After a lecture of mine on sociological theory, a perceptive student said to me, "You sure have a hang-up on order, don't you?" And I had to concede the description. But I also added that my hang-up was not arbitrary or inadvertent. Behind it is the conviction that sociology leads to the understanding that order is the primary imperative of social life. How about putting that under the rubric of Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Yimloch Leolam Va'ed, and repeating it on every single page of the prayer book? There is the additional conviction that this fact is rooted in the fundamental constitution of man. Here we get very close to Reconstructionism. We're talking about basic human needs, not fly-by-night ideas that ad hoc committees set up. That it is rooted in the basic fundamental constitution of man. That is, that not only sociology, but philosophical anthropology, and one might add psychoanalysis, must lead to a hang-up on order. Society in its essence is the imposition of order upon the flux of human experience. Social life abhors disorder as nature abhors a vacuum. And he goes on to talk about the implications of those who speak of permanent revolution, especially as it has affected China. That is to say, the idea of permanent revolution is a contradiction in terms. Society is extraordinarily precarious. Except for rare and invariably brief periods, the forces of order in society are always stronger than those of disorder, and further, that there are fairly narrow limits to the toleration of disorder in any human society. the left by and large understands that all social order is precarious, it generally fails to understand that just because of this precariousness, societies will react with almost instinctive violence to any fundamental or long-lasting threat to their order. So the idea of permanent revolution is an anthropologically absurd fantasy. We must go on to the next concept, which is zichronot. We've dealt with Adonai Melech, that is to say, what we do when we refer in the prayer book to those nitty-gritty laws about where you sprinkle the blood, whether on the north side or the south side or the east side and the west side, you may laugh to distraction about those futile laws, but you only endure as a civilized human beings because somebody is prepared to commit themselves to those laws. And we can afford to carry parasites on our back because there are enough people who are prepared to anonymously carry the ongoing burden of the kingship of society. What matters? What does it matter whether we say Adonai Melech or whether we affirm that we need some kind of system and order? It adds up to the same thing. We Jews say Adonai Melech because, understandably, being a group within the group, we wish to affirm that being Jewish also affirms order, and that Jews cannot take the law into their own hands and decide who shall or shall not be Jewish, who shall or who shall not be married, who shall or who shall not do this, that, or the other. That, oh, come on, isn't synagogue life about having a good time? It's not. Insofar as the synagogue embodies the community, it has to pay some kind of tribute to system and law and order. On some level, if the synagogue does not affirm Adonai Melech, it violates its most sacred trust. Secondly, the idea of continuity, God remembers, the Lord of history, is closely related to, but not identical with, the imperative of order. He also is paying tribute to the notion that you can't separate these ideas completely. They intersect. They are somewhat amorphous. They can be focused on, but they shade over into other meanings. I suppose he says, finally, the centrality of continuity in society is rooted in the simple fact that people have children. If one has children, one is required to explain the past to them. Look, as a Jew, if one has children in the age of the Holocaust, one must explain the past to them and to relate the present to the past. If one loves one's children, and I take it that this is the case with most people who have them, one will want to project into the future whatever good things one has possessed in one's own life, and there are few people, even among the most oppressed, who have possessed nothing good at all. Conversely, if one loves one's parents, and the current generation crisis notwithstanding, I'm inclined to think that this too is something of an anthropological constant, one will not finally want to disparage everything that constituted the parents' world, especially if one comes to have children of one's own, who not only ask what will become of them, but also ask from whence they come. Children are our hostages to history. Consequently, to be a parent means, however dimly and whatever level of intellectual sophistication, to have a stake in the continuity of the social order. Finally, and on this point I'm going to conclude, the imperative of triviality. Allow me to quote a little more lengthily because I think here Peter Berger excels himself, and he's usually excellent to begin with. The imperative of triviality, and here we are on the third of the Jewish Trinity, shofarot, the shofar that was blown on Mount Sinai. The shofar also refers to the Messianic era when Torah will come to an end, which is the utopian way of expressing that insight which is behind the most boring legislation, the idea that one day the state will wither, that there will be no need to have rules and regulations. People will drive under 50 miles an hour without having an electronic policeman on their tail. It's utopian, by the way. I don't want to mislead anybody about this. So the third refers to the idea of revelation, the imperative of triviality. The boredom of the mitzvot. Do we have to do this again? Another Shabbos? Singzimert again? More kashrut? More davening? Shul again? The same kind of service? Can't we experiment? Can't we have something new? Can't we have something more exciting? Why can't we blow our minds every week? Or as Rabbi Zalman Schachter once suggested, passed round the sugar cubes with the LSD drop before Kol Nidre so as to have a real good Yom Kippur. Why not really blow the mind? Start doing something strange. Let's take our clothes off and hug each other. Let's bring S to the synagogue. Listen what the more conservative sociologist has to say about triviality. The imperative of triviality is, again, I suspect, rooted in some basic facts of the human condition, namely the facts, and this applies to synagogue services so much that it's unbelievable that Peter Berger never became a rabbi. What he has to say about triviality is so fundamental to Jewish education, so fundamental to the idea of what it means to have a synagogue and for a synagogue to survive in any meaningful fashion. The imperative of triviality is, again, I suspect, rooted in some basic facts of the human condition, namely the facts that man's attention span is limited and that he can only tolerate a limited amount of excitement. Perhaps the physiological foundation of this concept is our need to sleep. Social life would be psychologically intolerable if each of its moments required from us full attention, deliberate decision, and high emotional involvement. It is for this reason that I would claim for the following proposition the status of a sociological axiom. Triviality is one of the fundamental requirements of social life. I could have brought out more examples from the Shacharit service, but the business about the sacrifices will do. Triviality is one of the fundamental requirements of social life. It is sociologically and probably anthropologically and perhaps even biologically necessary that a goodly portion of social life take place in a state of only dim awareness. It's so important for Reconstructionists, above all people, to hear this. If you will, in a state of semi-sleep. Anybody who has been to a Reconstructionist convention will know exactly what I'm talking about. It is precisely to permit this to happen that the institutional order imposes programs for the individual's activity. Society protects our sanity by preempting a large number of choices, not only of action, but of thought. If we understand this, then we will see that there are limits not only to disorder and discontinuity, but also, more importantly perhaps, there are limits to the frequency of significant events. We will then become very careful how we view meaningless rituals, empty forms, or mere routines in social life, simply because we will recognize that if social life in its entirety were charged with profound meaning, we would all go out of our minds. The meaninglessness of so much of social life, which is currently decried as the source of social alienation, and he's talking in the 60s, of course, when it would have been very dangerous to even quote this in a synagogue. The meaninglessness of so much of social life, which is currently decried as the source of so-called alienation, is in fact a necessary condition for both individual and collective sanity. The currently fashionable left ideal of full participation, in the sense that everybody will participate in every decision affecting his life. And in that sense, I believe that our open microphone is a relic of the 60s. Would, if realized, but it's something that many members of the SAJ are really not prepared to honestly think about right now. That is to say, this idea that every time anybody opens their mouths, everybody else must open their mouths at the same time and get it all out, because otherwise the world will come to an end if an idea is left vague or obscure or slightly unfinished or not fully teased out, or if, God forbid, the rabbi has got away with anything that cannot be totally endorsed 1,000,000% by all the leading scientists in the world, that somehow West 86th Street will simply sink into the nether world, that somehow every single moment of synagogue life has to be relevant, participatory, and involved. The currently fashionable, and incidentally, we also were influenced by the 60s and created our own dogmatism, our own orthodoxy. Notice how conservative Reconstructionists can get when the chips are down. The currently fashionable left ideal of full participation, in the sense that everybody would participate in every decision affecting his life, would, if realized, constitute a nightmare comparable to unending sleeplessness. Fortunately, it is anthropologically unrealizable, though the endless discussion that goes on in radical groups gives a certain approximation of the horror that its realization would signify. It is one of the mercies of human nature that finally all participants and all discussants must fall asleep. Well, having said that, I obviously have to open the microphone, and so for a few brief minutes, although I will tell those of you who have been so committedly coming regularly for the last several months, I know that there are some of you Could I just ask a very simple question and ask those of you who have heard all of these talks to put your hand up and give me some kind of indication of what the continuity is in this particular discussion? Well, that's a very reassuring thought. Huh? You mean some have been to them all of the time, and all of them have been to them some of the time, but not all of them have been to them all of the time? I think it's a pretty good record, especially since I'm now not only getting some very interesting comments verbally, by telephone and after the service, incidentally not always through the open microphone, because many people say that they find they are able to react better if they're able to reflect a little more on what was said, as opposed to the feeling that they've got to get up and say something, otherwise the synagogue will collapse. And I've tried to tell people that if we have an open microphone session, God forbid, one Saturday, and nobody feels that they have something terribly revelatory to talk about, the world will not come to an end if we simply sit and meditate for a few minutes. I get the feeling that people are so itchy that if nobody comes up, they feel they have a mission to civilization to prevent the SAJ from dying of chaos. It's not the case. Let's try it sometime. It really isn't the case. We have to try to rethink some of our ideas in terms of what has been going on. So I think at this point then, having said this, these ideas will not be left, because what Berger says about these three concepts, which basically are our Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot, we really have to consider these. And now I'm asking Warren Schnur for a very brief period of time to make sure that the world doesn't collapse.
Shabbat Shalom. Principally for the benefit of our visitors this morning, the Rabbi kept referring to the open microphone, which is this portion of the study period of our service, where congregants, members of the congregation, both members of the synagogue and guests, are invited to come forward and to comment on some aspects of the Rabbi's talk. Now, we solicit people to come forward, but as the Rabbi said, it is not imperative. It is equally responsible for us to sit and contemplate on some of the very interesting and very deep thoughts that were expressed here this morning. If you do come forward, we ask one or two things. Number one, we ask you to state your name and indicate whether you are a member of the SAJ or a guest. Number two, we ask you to be relevant to what was discussed. And number three, we ask you to be brief. The Rabbi indicated we just have a few minutes. We would like a number of people, if you are so inclined, to come forward. So please keep your remarks to no more than 2.5, 3 minutes at the most. If you exceed that, I will get up and ask you in a very nice way, or the nicest way I know how, to please bring your remarks to an end. The microphone is now open.
My name is Joyce Miller. I'm a member of the congregation. I think that one of the things that's happening in the 80s is a tendency to decry some of the things that some of us did in the 60s. I think that because the open microphone is an idea of the 60s does not mean that it's not necessarily a good idea. Some of us feel uncomfortable speaking in public. Some of us are more comfortable with it. But I think that there is nevertheless something to be gained from those of us who do feel comfortable or semi-comfortable with getting up and contributing something that they feel is worthwhile contributing, and frequently is. I've heard many good ideas coming forth at the open microphone. I would be very sorry to see the end of such an institution. I feel that at times there were comments made immediately upon a sermon, in the spirit in the sermon, in which the sermon has been given, which contribute to the discussion, contribute to the thought, and have a very positive and beneficial effect. And that to have someone call privately or talk upstairs at Kiddush or whatever doesn't have that same effect, and the congregation also does not benefit from it. It loses its immediacy, it loses its impact, and then again, not everybody is privy to it, only a small group of people who happen to be reached by the individual.
My name is Larry Geiger. I'm a guest here, and I'm a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Rabbinical School. And the reason I wanted to get up this morning is that this is the second Shabbat morning in a row that I've been here, and I wanted to take the opportunity to say Amen to everything that Rabbi Miller has to teach us. I think that this congregation is very fortunate in having the person who really understands what Reconstructionism is all about. There are a lot of people in official Reconstructionist positions who I'm not so sure understand what Reconstructionism is all about. What I really want to share with you that's directly related to what the rabbi was talking about is that after I got out of the seminary, I spent 7 years in the sociology department at Columbia University. And the reason I did that is because I was very impressed by what Dr. Kaplan had to say, and I thought that if I wanted to follow in Dr. Kaplan's footsteps, I'd have to first become a sociologist. In the process of doing that, I lived through many experiences of the 60s at Columbia, and specifically in April, May, June of 1968, I lived through the SDS rebellion at Columbia. And apropos of the reading material that Rabbi Miller shared with us today from Peter Berger, it's interesting that it's absolutely correct that, sociology is both subversive as to thinking and conservative as to behavior, so to speak. I think that is quite appropriate. What's interesting, however, is that if, having lived through that SDS rebellion there, I can report to you from bitter experience, from personal involvement, and I was not an SDSer, by the way. I'm not a revolutionary, one of the quiet people, right? What happened was that the sociology department absolutely fell into bits and was totally fragmented and destroyed by the SDS rebellion. It was totally unable to translate its cognitive insight into the operation of society, into the day-to-day operation of how to preserve the university. And most paradoxically and most astonishingly, it was the English department at Columbia University that did the best job of dealing with the implications of the SDS rebellion and in preserving the fabric of the social order. So these guys who sat around and talked English literature all the time turned out to be the ones who could make society work at the time. Now, I have just an implication that I like to draw. I know I'm going over time, so you can cut me off at any point you want. Okay, I'll try to bring it to a head. The implication that I'd like to draw from this is that, as I said at the beginning, I wanted to acknowledge Rabbi Miller as a spokesman for the essence of Reconstructionism, because so many of the official spokesmen do not understand what it's all about, just as sociologists don't often have the capacity to keep social order going. And what I'd like to invite you to respond to is the concept of Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. The Bible taught us that what's unique about the Jewish people is that we are expected, all of us, to be priests. Each one of us is expected to be an expert. And that's what, if you want to be a Reconstructionist, as Rabbi Miller said, you have to know the Bible, you have to know the Talmud, and you have to be an expert to share in the creative process of keeping the operation going. Anyway, I'm sorry I took the extra time, you'll forgive me, but I had to say something, as they say, all right?
My name is Jean Anderson, and I'm a member of the congregation. And I just want to say that having spent about 25 years as a graduate student in the Department of Sociology at Columbia, that Rabbi Geiger did not exaggerate one bit. And that one of the things we have to recognize about sociologists is that they like to talk about norms and like not to internalize them.
You do have time for one more. You just made it. I was just getting up to say we have time for one more speaker, and also I'd like to add, for the benefit of our guests, the rabbi does not normally respond to these remarks. He does make note of them and refers to them sometimes in future talks that he gives. But we feel that this is something that the congregation should participate in and not give the rabbi the last shot. He reserves that to himself.
My name is Alan Iser. I'm not a member of the congregation. I am, though, a graduate student in Jewish history, and I feel one of the things I have learned is, although order is very important in the hierarchy of Jewish values, there are some other things that we can learn, which is to be suspicious of those who are the masters of order also. For example, just to give one appropriate quotation from Pirkei Avot, we have Al titkarev lemalchut. Do not become, I guess you could translate it, too chummy with those in powers. So I would say that while Judaism preaches order, it also tells us to have a healthy suspicion of those who are the masters of order at the same time.
Nothing like the West London Synagogue, is it? Nothing like the West London Synagogue. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.